Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing well, and I also hope you're keeping very warm and getting that lovely hot cup of cocoa, because I want you to get lovely and cozy because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pierre and I'm from Alberta in Western Canada, from an exquisitely beautiful part of the world, with an enviable landscape and all-encompassing statuesque mountains, prairies, desert badlands and vast areas of dreamy coniferous forest. I grew up in the incredible town of Jasper, which is the starting point of the Jasper National Park, amidst the mysterious magic of the Canadian Rockies. The extraordinary, vibrant, bustling town of Jasper is utterly charming, with hanging flower pots filled with bright seasonal flowers in summer, manicured gardens, quaint little shops, decadent ice cream parlours, restaurants and buildings, many with attractive rocky facades, that give this town its quintessential congenial rustic ambience. If that were not enough to boast about, everything here is surrounded by panoramic, imposing, statuesque mountainous views that tower into the blue expanse of firmament like monstrous rugged pyramids of natural art, created by Mother Nature herself. If you visit this part of the world, you should take the gondola up to Whistler Mountain and soak in a natural hot spring here, or marvel at our turquoise lakes that can quite literally take your breath away, or go skiing at Mammoth Basin. Many tourists come to our part of the world to take in the beguiling, scenic and splendiferous beauty of the Canadian Rockies. I grew up in the pretty Jasper neighbourhood, the only son of two French parents, who are French-speaking and originally from Quebec. The residential houses where I live are built very close together, but the houses are all sizable, with decent-sized front and back yards. I was raised up in a typical French country-style home, which boasted traditional stone floors, distressed ceilings, wooden beams, carved panels, beautiful wooden armoires, and delicate carvings that were complemented by my mother's stylish taste in rustic furnishings, which added a touch of je ne sais quoi to the overall look. Our two-storey white brick symmetrical home featured tall rectangular windows that aligned in perfect symmetry with the batten-style shutters painted in light blue-green paint, with large French-style glass doors that opened up into a formal French-style front yard, which consisted of landscape, geometrical-styled gardens with mini hedges and pretty white flowers. I must confess that living in this part of the world is so enchanting and idyllic because of the magnificent panoramic scenery here. The fresh mountain air and the carefree, easygoing pace of life is something I cherish dearly and value so very much. Both my parents work in the town of Jasper, where they run a superb coffee shop that is a magnet for all the tourists visiting our neck of the woods, and has proved to be a lucrative business because tourism thrives in this part of the world, and it's a good source of income for many of the locals that live here. This is a place that as a young boy kept me perpetually absorbed and entertained, as the natural world is indeed quite fascinating, intriguing and exceedingly alluring. I used to adore playing in the wooded area with friends and engaging in hiking, climbing, camping and fishing pursuits. You would think that I had multiple opportunities to encounter the hairy man, but you would be very wrong. I say that because even if you live in this part of the world, which is a perfect Bigfoot habitat, even if I say so myself, that elusive critter is like a clever fish that is not going to bite the worm at the end of your fishing rod, because it knows so much better, and it just ain't going to be fooled. I believe that the ambiguous Bigfoot is out there in the Canadian Rockies, but he remains elusive, evasive and out of plain sight. So more often than not he keeps well out of the minds of most of the folk that live here. Indeed, I imagine that many doubt in the existence of such an obscure, strange, mythical beast, and those who claim to have encountered the hairy critter are soon silenced by their cynics and sceptics who claim to know better, and will say, "Sorry, mate, but I think you actually saw a bear." Is it any wonder that so many refuse to share their intriguing stories, and who could blame them? I certainly don't. My strange story begins in 1994 when I was 31 years old and was living in a house 2 doors away from my parents' home that was also French country style and had been sumptuously decorated by my mother's extravagant and very good taste. I snapped it up the moment it came on the market because I love living in close proximity to my parents as our family is indeed very close. I had reached a pivotal time in my life when I was feeling the pestering pressure from all of my friends and family to get married. It wasn't articulated in verbal words, of course, but I could see by the pitiful expressions on their faces that they felt nauseatingly sorry for me. They would say things like, "When are you going to get married and make an honest man of yourself?" If I was a guest at a friend's wedding, which was becoming increasingly more common of late, I would get an encouraging nudge and someone would whisper in my ear, "Hopefully it'll be you next time." I promise you I found that all incredibly belittling, humiliating and very offensive, and it did make me exceedingly angry. I was happy in my life, and if I was not married, please for goodness sake don't patronise me by being all sorry for me, and spare your crocodile tears for someone who rarely needs them. That's how I felt at the time. Then if that wasn't bad enough, I heard that there were rumours circulating around the local town that I was a closet gay and was afraid to come out. Even my own mother began to doubt me and asked me if I had something I wanted to tell her. I remember looking at her aghast and saying, "What would I have to tell you?" "Well, darling, you're still unmarried. I was wondering if you were possibly gay." I remember looking at her in horror. "Mum," I said, "if I was gay, you'd be the first to know about it. If I'm not married, it may have something to do with the fact that I've not found the right girl yet." "But, darling," she interjected, "you've had so many delightful, very attractive girlfriends over the years. What's stopping you from tying the knot? What about that lovely girl? Nicola, what was her name? Remember you were seeing her. Now, she was a very nice girl." "Mum, I wouldn't want to settle down with any of those girls, as lovely as you may say that they are." "Why ever not, darling? You can't expect Cinderella to come along. Life is not a fairy tale. It doesn't work like that. You need to learn to make the best of what you've got. I did that with your father. I settled." "What, Mum?" I gasped. "I thought you fell in love with Dad." "Heavens, no," chuckled my mother. "I wasn't in love with your father when we married, but I knew he would be a good father for you and would take very good care of me as well." "You mean you married Dad without love?" I asked my mother, looking appalled. "Darling, what is love? I'm very fond of your father, of course, and he has grown on me over the years. But love? From the beginning? No, absolutely not." "You must have at least been attracted to Dad," I asked my mother. My mother burst out laughing. "Attracted to your dad?" She laughed. "Never. Have you not noticed how he walks like a chicken, chews with his mouth wide open, and snores like a bulldog? No, attraction was definitely not part of the deal, dear. But over the years, my bulldog that walks like a chicken and chews with his mouth wide open has grown on me somewhat, and I'm extremely fond of your dad, and I wouldn't want to be with anybody else for that matter, if that's any consolation to you." "So you do love him then?" I protested. "Well, now I do," she said, "but certainly not on the day that I walked down the aisle with him. No, not then." I remember my mother's appalling, blunt revelations to me were outrageous. Was this where I was going wrong, I wondered? Was everybody out there just settling for a suitable mate, rather than falling madly in love? Maybe falling in love was overrated, or was something that grew over time, and was not a spark that ignited immediately between two people, like romantic novels so claimed. I was possibly too much of a romantic at heart, but I emphatically knew in my gut that if I'd married any of my ex-girlfriends, the relationships would have turned sour, like curdled milk. It was not from want of trying, of course. I mean, I'd exhausted every avenue available, and been on multiple dates, but it would seem that I always ended up empty-handed, because I never connected with any of the girls I met. I always sensed that something was missing. Was I wrong to feel this way, I wondered? From that moment on, I decided that I was not going to allow people's comments about my unmarried state to put pressure on me. If it meant living on my own for the rest of my life, then so be it, even if I were to hear the faint murmurs of people whispering in the background, "He must be gay." Fast forward several weeks, and my friend Martin, who was my only unmarried friend at the time, agreed to join me for a camping excursion on a private camping ground close to the national park. Imagine my disappointment when I went to pick Martin up at his apartment, and I noticed he was green at the gills and was throwing up violently. What rotten luck, I thought. I went on an all-night drinking binge last night, and I feel like the Walking Dead, he told me. Can we please put a rain check on the weekend? I was bitterly disappointed because I'd counted on getting away this weekend, and now it would seem that Martin had selfishly put a spanner in the works. It was then that I made the decision to go solo camping. No, it wasn't ideal. It wasn't my first choice, but if I wanted to get away, I was going to have to settle for my own company. Before long, I was driving up a gravel road, which led to a cattle gate with a sign that read Private Camping Ground, and there was a combination lock on the gate with a code that had been given to me by the owner. I opened the gate and drove through the heavily wooded area that overlooked the most exquisite shimmering silver lake. It was not long before I had set up a camping site in an open clearing overlooking the idyllic lake that shimmered like a sparkling jewel in the noonday sun and was heavily flanked by a dreamy, pristine-looking forest. It was so exquisitely beautiful that I began to feel incredibly glad that I had come. I immediately prepared a fire pit and began to assemble a hot cup of coffee for myself by boiling a pot of water on the fire while I sat back and enjoyed the exquisite panoramic views over the shimmering silver lake, along with the quacking wild ducks that were paddling along the water with the fluffiest of ducklings that I've ever seen. It was then that I heard the musical, animated laughter of female voices, and I realised that someone was setting up camp in the clearing further down the banks of the lake. I immediately felt a wee bit annoyed and peeved off. I was hoping to have some quiet time to myself, away from the interfering sounds of strangers, which was why I had chosen a private camping ground in the very first place. I decided to investigate how close these campers were to my tent, and so off I rambled towards their camping site. It was then that I saw her, and my heart almost stopped beating. A young woman was coming out of the tent laughing. There was something about her energy that took my breath away. The only way I can describe her is that she was not your quintessential typical American beauty. I'd never ever been interested in that typical blonde type before that so many men gladly pursue. I liked women with interesting and exciting looks, and for me this woman possessed intriguing features that were captivating, alluring, and very different. I liked that about her. I noticed she had a smooth, flawless porcelain skin, shoulder-length curly dark hair, and the most piercing blue eyes that I've ever seen. In that moment I knew I had to meet her, but my confidence began to shrink, and I began to feel very insecure. What would I say, I wondered, but every idea that came to mind seemed ridiculous, pathetic, and almost puny. I could hear her musical voice saying to her friends, "I'll go and get some dry wood from the pit. The fire's not taking because the wood is way too damp." As the young woman walked into the woods, she stopped very suddenly as she observed me. She hadn't been expecting to see me standing there in the tree line, and looked rather bewildered to see me. "Are you the owner of the camping ground?" she asked me suddenly. "Oh no," I said. "I'm solo camping further up the lake." "Oh, so you're our neighbour," she laughed, giving me such a ravishing smile that melted my heart like butter. "I couldn't help overhearing that you're battling with your fire pit. Would you like some help? I'm pretty good at getting a fire started." "That would be wonderful," she said. So from there began the most beautiful romantic relationship with a stunning young woman called Freya, and from the first instant I met her, there was electricity between us, and I knew I was falling head over heels in love with her, and 6 months later we were married. Fast forward to the year 2000, which was about 5 years after we had married, and my wife discovered that she was 3 weeks pregnant with our very first child. We were so thrilled and excited that we decided to celebrate the good news by going camping in the same private camping location where we had met 6 years prior. All we could talk about was the prospect of becoming parents and whether our baby was going to be a girl or a boy. "It's going to be a girl," said Freya, smiling at me with wide eyes. "I just feel it in my gut. It's a girl." Before long, we arrived at the camping ground and chose to camp in the identical location where I'd initially camped the first time we'd met. This brings so many memories back to me, said my wife. I remember the first time I saw you in the woods. It was so beautiful, so romantic. How could I ever forget? It was the best day of my life, laying my eyes on you, I said. As we sat around the fire pit under the silvery stars and the bright ivory moon, we listened to the sounds of crickets and frogs, and my wife talked about what it would be like to become first-time parents, and all about the curious journey that lay ahead of us. I cooked a delicious barbecue of honey and mustard chicken kebabs and marinated spare ribs, which we ate with salad and garlic bread. It was absolutely delicious. Before long, we retired to our sleeping bags and fell fast asleep. My wife got up during the night to relieve herself and then woke me up violently to tell me that she had seen some red eyes staring at her from about 8 foot off the ground, and she was almost certain that she had heard a guttural growl and several grunts. I crept out of the tent with my headlamp and with my rifle in tow, and then I saw them for myself. A pair of red eyes stared at me from about 8 feet off the ground, only several yards away from me. I had no idea what it was until the gargantuan, dark form moved into my field of vision, where shafts of moonlight illuminated the critter so that I could see him so very clearly. He pulled back his lips to reveal these large human-like teeth, and made a low guttural growl, and began to pound his chest with his fists in a gesture of dominance. I was so terrified that I actually wet myself. I stood there shaking violently, only to realise in horror that my wife was standing beside me. Could it get worse than that? In those moments I was almost certain that we were both going to die, because the creature was just so massive, so formidable, and so utterly terrifying. I knew if I shot at him I was unlikely to take him down, because he was built so powerfully like an army tank, and such a foolish action would guarantee that we would not come out of this alive, because one blow from this creature and it was over cadovers for the both of us. I was so petrified that words failed to express the paralysing terror that engulfed my whole being. My heart was flapping like a pair of heavy eagle wings, and I could feel the heavy vibration of its thumps beneath my chest. I wanted to scream, but my dry throat seemed to clam up like an oyster shell. I began walking backwards, guiding my wife very carefully towards the tent, as the critter continued to growl, very much like a lion, causing the ground beneath me to vibrate. And he also made these strange screaming noises that sent shivers down my spine and sounded like this. Oh! 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 My brain had turned into soft sludge, and I could not perceive my thoughts or even engage my mind in a plan of escape, because the paralysing fear imprisoned my rational mind. The critter was easily 8 foot tall and was covered in long dark hair with overlong arms and very, very powerful legs. It had the most enormous shoulders that you could ever imagine possible, and a large cone-shaped head that seamlessly blended into those shoulders, and the creature did not appear to have a neck. I could see that it was built for strength, power and speed, and it had a long angular face with leathery, very wrinkled skin. I never got to see the face in detail, as I was so intent on not challenging it by staring at its eyes or making any kind of eye contact. To my horror, the creature grabbed me in his overlong arms very violently, and then lifted me off the ground and threw me into the air like a frisbee, as if I weighed nothing but a feather, where he caught me in his arms. I knew it was over for me in that moment, and as crazy as it sounds, I was reconciled to my deadly fate. All of a sudden, the most extraordinary thing happened. I heard this loud, indignant chattering sound, and before I knew it, I was lifted out of the male's arms by another big pair of overlong arms that gently placed me safely on the ground, where I scurried back to my wife, who was shaking in terror and crying. The tears were pouring down her face. In amazement, I observed a female critter, and I knew she was female because her breasts were covered with hair, and she was chattering away furiously at the male and slapping him dozens of times over with her overlarged hands. It was clear that she ruled the roost in their family, and she was giving him a huge telling off. I could tell he was in very big trouble and actually looked quite scared of the indignant female, and he was avoiding eye contact with her at all costs. He looked like a naughty puppy that had peed in the passage and knew he had done something very wrong and was being seriously reprimanded for very bad behaviour. The female kept chattering away angrily, and she pointed at my wife's belly and continued to give the male a very hard time. I couldn't believe it. This female critter knew that my wife was pregnant. How was that even possible? How could she know? My wife wasn't even showing. We watched in amazement as the male critter glided to the forest, while the female pointed to my wife's belly and began to chatter away at us excitedly in a very gentle, kindly tone that was so congenial, friendly and warm. I kept hearing the words in my mind, "It's a girl, it's a girl." Moments later, the sheepish, humiliated male came back with a peace offering in his hands, which was a stone, or rather looked like a fossil with a picture of a fern on it of some sort, that he begrudgingly handed to my wife, which we had clearly been told to give her under strict instructions from the female. He looked very bashful and somewhat ashamed of his behaviour, as if he'd been well and truly put in his place. We watched in astonishment as the creatures both glided back into the woods, and then my wife and I wasted no time in packing up all our belongings and getting the heck out of the place. My wife began crying in the car and sobbing. "That horrible monster! He nearly killed you," she said. "I don't know how I would have coped without you. That female saved your life." After we returned to Jasper and reflected about what had happened, we came to the conclusion that the male critter was a very big bully who was being chastised by his mother or partner for behaving so aggressively towards us. I do now wonder if he was being territorial and regarding the camping spot as his abode. We know that the female almost certainly saved my life, and the extraordinary thing is the words "it's a girl" were also conveyed by the creature to my wife's mind, almost telepathically. My wife believes the stone she got from the creature, or fossil if you like, was some kind of a lucky symbol, and it would seem that she sailed through her pregnancy with no morning sickness or without much anguish in the delivery of our baby, which I'm glad to tell you was a beautiful girl we called Amber Jane, who was born on April the 25th, 2001, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces. We were two very happy, proud parents. All these years later, my wife and I are still very happily married and still so much in love, with 1 girl and 2 boys, and we live in my French-style home 2 houses down from my parents. All these years later, I'm very certain that we encountered Bigfoots, and to tar them all with the same brush would indeed be folly. My impression is that you will get male Bigfoots that are big bullies, much like elephants that come into musk, possibly due to the same thing, high levels of testosterone, and I can only hope they have a feisty female to put them in their place and to correct any objectionable behaviour. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, I really loved that story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. Until next time, goodbye and good night.